Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm so happy to see such a great turnout. Before we get started, just make sure there's a sign-up sheet going around, so make sure that you've had a chance to sign it, if that's appropriate for you to do. I'm going to let Dr. Peska introduce our speaker because she, indeed, was once a student in Dr. Lorig's class. So she will have better stories than I do with which to introduce him. So. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tyler Lorig. Dr. Lorig received his undergraduate degree in psychology from Georgia Southwestern College. He went to the University of Georgia, where he completed his master's and doctoral work in biopsychology, and then to Yale University, where he studied olfaction using psychophysiology techniques like some of you are having a lab practical on tomorrow. Tyler holds the Ruth Parmalee Professorship at Washington and Lee, where he is a member of the psychology department and the neuroscience program, which he was the longtime chair of. His research specialty is cognitive neuroscience, and he's spent the last 30 years trying to understand how the human brain makes sense of the smells it encounters. He has written extensively on the nature of human odor, perception, the respiratory system, and methods for understanding the functioning brain. Tyler's the author of more than 70 scholarly articles and chapters, and is on the editorial board of Chemosensory Perception and Elements of Perception. He spent last year working in Washington, D.C. as an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Congressional Fellow, and often serves on the National Institute of Health and National Science Foundation grant reviews. From 1990 to 1994, he served as my undergraduate advisor and gave me some of the best advice I got in college, which was to use the summer between my junior and senior year to investigative sleep research was really for me. In doing that, I got into a graduate program I never would have been admitted to, and for that I have almost forgiven him for making me take calculus as a fall term freshman.
You were my advisor too, before, as a freshman?
Yes.
Oh my God.
That's right, oh my gosh.
And she, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hello, Hendrix. It's great to be here. Gosh, there are a lot of you. Thank you very much. It's late for talks. I appreciate especially all the students who are here who should be studying rather than being here. Thank you. And the faculty who are going to get a lot of overtime pay, if there was in fact overtime pay for faculty, which there isn't. So it's great to see you guys. Thanks. So I'm going to tell you guys a story tonight, and it's a long, sad story, just like all the stories I tell. And it has to do with clinical psychology and research psychology and neuroscience and the interplay of that. There's intrigue, there's all kinds of stuff. And if you have questions in the middle of this, feel free to ask. I'm a professor, so I do this. So I've also never given this talk before. So I'm thinking I have like until 11 o'clock, right?
No.
Okay.
I lab practical tomorrow.
So let's look at this. So Future of Psychology in the Age of Neuroscience, very exciting title. What makes me think it's the age of neuroscience? Well, it was a presidential proclamation. It's not, doesn't say, none of these say the age of neuroscience, right? They say we're going to have the decade of the brain. The decade of the brain was the 1990s, and George Bush, that was the first one, George Bush put this together in 1990, and like almost all presidential proclamations about science, it was absolutely covered by the media. The media just went great. This is going to be great. There's all this story about science. How much money was given up by the federal government for funding of this? That's the right answer. There was no money given up. There was no budget for this. Now, over his tenure and over the tenure of Bill Clinton, there was actually quite a lot of money that was given for this. And I'll just point out one more thing, because, really, guys, you were all born in the decade of the brain. So, be pretty excited about that. So you have had this thing happen. We really didn't know a heck of a lot about brain sciences. There was no real fMRI at the beginning of the 1990s. That was its childhood, was the 1990s. It had been born, but nobody really had ever heard of it. So we had these programs that started to be born around that time. And so I'm going to show you this very busy slide, which I have a way to show you here. So we're looking now at undergraduate neuroscience programs. And so back in 1986, there were about 7 undergraduate neuroscience programs in America. Washington Lee had theirs in 1990. But look what happened as that decade passed in terms of the number of undergraduate neuroscience. This ends in 2008. I was not able to find the current number of undergraduate neuroscience programs right now. But that number here's the axis over here. That number is probably around 180 to 190 currently neuroscience programs that are specifically for undergraduate degrees in neuroscience. If you look at the number of students graduating in that, it absolutely perfectly matches the curve with these. So you have this change. Over here, these are, this is a weird graph, but they show you the number added each year to give you an idea that right around the turn of the century, 1999, you started to see a large number of changes there. And I want to point out a couple of other things. If you look at the most popular college majors, of course, places that offer business degrees are very popular. Allied health, that's not what you get at liberal arts colleges, either one of them usually. It's psychology and biology. And so since psychology and biology are usually the two things that most go together often for neuroscience programs, you have this monstrous triumvirate of programs, psychology, biology, and neuroscience, which at my institution are the same size. So they're the same number of students in all of those areas. And so we form the largest major on our campus with those three because they're just overwhelming. So the other thing I'll tell you, which is not good, and I apologize that you can't see this really well, these are the number of, these are the PhDs who have graduated at these years. And we're out to 2011 here. You'll notice that they're all kind of the same, all grouped in here. This is molecular biology, psychology, biochemistry, and neuroscience. So right now, we are seeing people who have neuroscience degrees who are going from postdoctoral study to postdoctoral study to postdoctoral study because it's very difficult to find a job in neuroscience at this point because of the input of these people in the degree program. Now they're eventually going to fall out of that, and you got to think about 15 years in advance. So there'll be jobs when you guys are moving out of your PhD programs in neuroscience, if that's what you're thinking about. But for the folks in the profession, as we look at what's going on, we're seeing, and there's a phrase for it, it's called the perpetual postdoc. And so for many of you who don't know, what happens, it's not enough to get your PhD. That just makes your parents happy. What happens next is that you go off and you do this 2 to 3 year period of intensive study where you are doing postdoctoral work, and you do that in places where you can get new kind of training, and that's going to get you into your first job, hopefully, and onto a professorship somewhere. So that's the way this all works. So let me ask you a question. How are you going to do on this? Everybody going to get this one right? What do you think? I just want to point out that part. What do you think? Neuroscience of science? Got some nodding going on. Yes, you may speak. What about this one? Yes. Really? Sure. You know it was a science when you came to Hendrix? Or were you just well trained? What do you think? Come on. Who thought psychology was a science when you walked through the door at Hendrix? We got a couple of hands. May I ask why you knew that?
Ology, not the other word.
Say again?
Ology, not the other word.
Ology, okay, all right. I had a student one time tell me because it's taught in the science building. That's actually, that answer satisfied a dean at another college at one point for giving more money to the psychology department. So I like that answer of being it's in the psychology, it's in the science building. So we don't know. I mean, so very few of you raised your hands. Let me point that out. You were not thinking of psychology as a science. Most people do not think of psychology as a science. And so I'm going to use myself as an example here. I'm going to show you where I was trained. This is the University of Georgia. No comments, please. Psychology department, right? And the reason I point it out is because it is so utterly typical, and it happens to have these floors, right? There are 5 floors here. You got clinical on the bottom. At the time it was handicap accessible, which made it an obvious place for the clinic. The developmental program, the part that studies children and their behavior, interactions with adults. Social psychology and the interactions of that with others. Cognitive, memory, learning, all kinds of processes related to that. And biopsychology, where I lived for a long time, hanging from that ceiling. Now, I'm not kidding about that. I hung from the ceiling because I was doing research here on this lovely creature. Anybody got a clue? It's a salamander, really big and ugly salamander. Yeah, it's a mud puppy. right? So they have eyes. They're too small to see in this photograph. And I was studying the retina of salamanders. So that was done in a setup that's like this without the computers. It was a long time ago. But the mud puppy eye would go on the platform there, and we would try and put a microelectrode, a 1 micron wide electrode, into a specific cell in the retina of this salamander in wind, which was blowing the building. And so the professor here had cages for his graduate students built that would hang from the ceiling. So when the other building moved, the cages inside would stay relatively stationary so that we could actually work on windy days. I hate you. It's fascinating, but you know, when you're in a little room, you can't really move. You can't drink coffee, and there are a lot of things you can't do there as you try to finally get this cell. And after hours and hours of trying to get the cell, then you record from it for 3 hours, and then you go to the bathroom. So that's just how this work goes. And it's hard, it's rigorous, and you learn a few things and a lot of things you don't learn. Does that seem like psychology? No, it doesn't, right? You know, so you know, this is not what people think of when they think of psychology, and yet it is. It's in the building, right? It's in the psychology building. So I think about this, and you got to kind of wonder what psychology really is and why we think of it this way. So I'm going to show you some research on what psychology is. I know you're going to have a little trouble with this. Now y'all got it immediately. Can I move to the next slide? So this is some research that was done in library science, and the library science work is really fascinating. What it does is it looks at the reference section of papers, and those reference sections which have to do with who you reference, right? So if I'm writing a paper, and let's say that paper is published in a journal called Psychological Science, and I reference another paper that's in, say, a biology journal in genetics, and another journal that is in, say, medicine, and I reference the journal in medicine 4 different times, and I reference the one in genetics once, and I reference, you know, another journal over here in physics, which I might if I'm studying vision because it's about optics. I'm actually closer to medicine because I've used a journal from that category more often. And so this is a map of what it looks like for all of psychology. So it's a really interesting map. And it's particularly interesting because you have psychological research which occupies this here. And I know you can't read these individual pieces, but they're, let me come around here, I'll help you do that. So maybe I won't. That's actually really hard to see. So I can't see that either. So no one mentioned I was old. So the point of this is there are a bunch of journals that are here that have to do with actually experimental psychology, perceptual science, those kinds of things. And they interact a lot with neuroscience. They interact with another set of journals that are associated with clinical psychology. Clinical psychology, in case you don't know, is a type of psychology that deals with mental health. Now that is what most of you imagined psychology was about. You imagined that psychology was completely about studying mental health. And that, you know, is a pretty reasonable idea. I'm going to point out one other thing for you. Where's neuroscience in this? And the answer is right in the middle of the science. This is part of why neuroscience has such enormous popularity, is because it actually is an integration of all of these different sciences together. Medicine and chemistry and biology, all of that goes together in neuroscience. And so a friend of mine wrote a really good paper about psychology being a hub science, because you have all of these, this is economics up here, those are other areas which have to do with, if you go to the outliers, you get to things like metallurgy. So those are really kind of distant and not really a hub of these fields, but psychology is very integrated in what it does. Neuroscience is even more so. So I'm going to show you a different version of this. Nice, huh? I like complicated graphs. I want you to notice a couple of things about neuroscience is in green, right? You may recognize some classes you've had. You've had social psych, many of you. Perception, obviously the most important thing in the world, which is what I study. And then you've got molecular neuroscience, behavioral genetics, and you can kind of see that genetics overlaps this big area within biology. Chemistry is this huge area out here that overlaps a lot with biology. Then you've got medicine, this enormous piece. And I want you to notice, there's a bunch of medicine that isn't biology. There's a bunch of medicine that's kind of its own field. And so medicine is something that is an applied branch of biology, but how many branches of applied biology are there? There are dozens, right? You got ecology, you got agronomy, there are just dozens of different ways that people use biology to understand it. Medicine is just one. Neuroscience, though, is once again this beautiful integration that has this great overlap. And the other thing I want you to notice is down here, so psychology is this big area, including clinical here. But in neuroscience, you have some stuff that really doesn't fit in psychology or in medicine, but is clearly a part of neuroscience. Neurolaw, something you guys may not have known exists. Neurolaw is actually a really important thing about culpability, about how it is that we're going to do, how are we going to manage the criminal justice system, and what do we do to help reduce recidivism. Those kinds of things are very important to this. The other kind of thing, you're a victim of neuromarketing, right? So people who are using lots of neurophysiological techniques to try and make products that you notice more, that you would see, you'll remember, that you have images of that are positive. Neurophilosophy, a very important part of neuroscience. One of the oldest, strangely. You have Patricia Churchland, who kind of brought this into neuroscience almost 30 years ago, in fact. And that's a vibrant area. So these are for real things. And then there are other things that are actually really new. We have neuroeducation, which is new to me. I got a brochure that says I should go to a neuroeducation workshop. I don't know what that means. And then my wife, who is a career counselor, got one to do a neurocounseling workshop. Well, I really don't know what that means. She didn't either. So she's a career counselor, and so she said this quote, right, everything is better with neuro on it. And it seems to be. It is a time when neuroscience is everywhere, and we are constantly looking at it. So let's look at what happens at the undergraduate level. So a much more simple way of looking at this. This is very similar to what we have going on at Hendrix, or Washington, and Lee, biology, psychology, neuroscience. Because, why? Why don't you see clinical psychology here? How many of you will leave Hendrix and go practice clinical psychology? Right. Only with this little period of time we call graduate school in between those, right? So if you're interested in being a mental health professional and interested in helping people deal with mental health problems, what you're going to do is spend some time here. You're going to go from here into a graduate program where you're going to actually do that with people, learn how to do it properly, and then you're going to go do the practice. That's great. That's how we plan it. It's kind of like medicine, isn't it? Where you actually you're maybe a biology major, maybe you're interested in all kinds of things with biochemistry. So you take that major and you find yourself then in a medical school, because they're not really going to let you practice medicine right out here, even if you were a biochem major, right? So that's good for those of us who may need that. So anyway, the point of this is that we train people to move on and do other kinds of things. In biology, you take a biology degree, you do medicine, perhaps, maybe other things, maybe you work in plant biology. You do psychology, what do? Mental health, right? Here's the evidence for that. So this is the breakdown of people who are members of the American Psychological Association, APA. You remember APA style? They're responsible. So here, these people, they call it applied psychology. That could be clinical or counseling psychology. It could be neuropsychology, geriatric psychology, industrial organizational psychology. That's the people in this section. I am seriously colorblind. That's blue, right? Okay, thank you. So that's a lot of people. Did I mention any of your faculty when I was talking about that group? They're not practitioners of psychology, are they? They're forming this group. They do research in psychology. They are the research psychologists. They make up about 12% of that group. So it's actually no wonder, there is literally no wonder that when you think of psychology, you think about clinicians. There they are. That's the people who are out there working And by the way, working hard to really do well for other people. And honestly, other people really need them, and we need a lot more of these people. So that's the thing. There's something really important to remember. This is a very important. These careers are unbelievably important. So I'm going to say some other things about getting to that career. Don't lose sight of the fact of how important I feel that those are. So here we are. We have a psychology department that doesn't represent this organization. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Shouldn't we have invited a whole bunch of folks who do clinical psychology to come and teach you? The answer to that is no. And the answer to that is A, that's not what they do. They're out there helping people with mental health problems. That's what the career that they chose. Number two, as I'm going to show you in a minute, there are some issues with how science gets done within clinical psychology that we want to make better over time. And so it's really a good thing that we have such an awesome psychology department. I've just spent 2 days with them, and they are, by the way, really, truly awesome. Anyway, how did all of this start? Who was the founder of psychology? Who's it? Anyone had his and sis here? Okay, well, who's the founder of psychology? Arguably Wilhelm Wundt. So if you were an American, who's the founder of psychology? Who thinks Freud is the founder of psychology? Nobody? Nobody? How about outside this room for folks who haven't had a psychology class? How many of your friends, now, come on, that's all right. So how many psychology majors? Okay, we got some folks, but most psychology majors, you told your friends you're a psychology major and they said, what? Talk about Freud. Talk about Freud, right? Where's your couch? You have a couch, right? So I get this a lot, and it's on an airplane and it's worse because you can't get away. What do you do? I'm a professor. Oh, what do you teach? Neuroscience. And they leave. They don't want to be near you, right? If you say, I'm a psychologist, what happens is they go, really? My Uncle Fred was crazy. And you go. Or, you get, trust me, you can become very knowledgeable about these folks' families in a really small amount of time. So, let's talk about this guy. Why do I show you this? Because that is such a cool picture. That is William James, right? So William James had the other psychology lab, the one that wasn't in Germany. And it was around this time in 1875 that he set up his lab at Harvard, and there he studied perception, memory, reaction time, and learning. Well, you got your psychology majors for the most part. That doesn't surprise you. That would surprise the people who are not psychology majors tremendously. What does that have to do with mental health care? They see the founder of psychology as this guy, right? This is the person who they think of most often when it comes to, who it is and who started psychology. And I'll tell you, so he studied cocaine. Freud gave us many opportunities to make fun of him. Okay, so he's also he was such a brilliant guy that he was pulled out of his class, and his parents were told that you have a genius for a son, and he will make you all rich if you just make sure he stays in school. And that turned out to be true. But of course, he donated, the interpretation of dreams, psychodynamic therapy. Let's please not talk about that. The interesting thing is he didn't particularly like psychology, right? You notice that he overlapped with William James. And he actually came to America and gave a talk where apparently, and I have been unable to find this, but one of my professors swears that it's true, that he was interviewed and asked what American psychology had to offer his theories, and his theories had to offer American psychology. He said, I don't really see that my theories have anything to offer American psychology, and I can't imagine what they could offer to me. Okay? So, maybe he's not the guy, right? All right, so so what we've been beating around the bush here about something that has to do with this. Psychology's public image. who we are, who we think we are, what we are really, I'll have you know that, the first meeting of the American Psychological Association was in 1892. Right? It's been around a while. And they had a meeting where they discussed the fact that nobody took them seriously. So this goes back for a ways, right? This goes back for ways in which we have folks that this psychology stuff, the public idea of what psychology is, they don't understand us. And it's just been, the kind of psychology's battle cry. You guys don't understand us. So, and honestly, I got to tell you, it's worse now. Here's one that you should look at. Modern surveys rate psychology as last among putative science departments for both its importance and the expertise of its faculty. Awesome. And it's worse among college faculty than in general college. It's all common sense, right? That's why the Golden Fleece Award comes to psychologists a lot. You guys, how many of you have heard of the Golden Fleece Award? Excellent. So this was an idea by the Dakota Senator William Proxmire, South Dakota, I think, who said this is a way of fleecing the government of funds. So he awarded a Golden Fleece Award to actually a number of psychologists because they were doing things that were stupid, right? And so it's gone to such notable folks, not a psychologist, but a biologist recently. This is my favorite. It's not a psychologist, it's my favorite. It's this guy who's at the University of Charleston in South Carolina who invented a treadmill for shrimp. The part that the senator's staff failed to tell him was how much shrimp the state of South Carolina produce each year. It's wild. It's almost the largest. Louisiana is bigger, but just barely. 2, shrimp that are in captivity don't move much, and so they get to have these nasty little bodies that we don't like to eat. And anyway, so the point of this is that he was looking for a way of keeping the tone in the muscle of these little shrimp so that they would be tastier products and make South Carolina a whole bunch more money. And so he was working on a prototype of a device that would allow millions of shrimp to exercise. Now I know that sounds crazy, but if you had better shrimp and it was more cost effective, we'd all be pretty happy. And South Carolina would love the fact that it came to their state. So you got to look a little deeper than this to see what's going on. Let me ask, I'm not going to ask this question of you guys because I think you'll know, but how many part of the general public realize that there's a difference between psychiatry and psychologists? And the answer is almost none. It's really rare. It's only when you get somebody who is seeing either one and who has been to the other that they switch that they actually know the difference. And so nearly no one knows about anyway, this idea that there's a non-clinical psychology. So yes, got that. You're there. You're really popular. It's 7:30. Here's the evidence that psychology is really popular. You're sitting in a room with an old guy telling you a story about psychology. Okay? That means it's popular. The practice of psychology, that is working with people to do mental health, is overwhelmingly devoted to mental health, right? They are. The people who do psychologists, who name themselves psychologists, who take the label psychologist, their job is to help the mentally ill and to help people deal with problems. But there's this other side of psychology, the part that you're learning about as you learn about the science of psychology. And it's about memory and perception, sleep, social interactions, and all that brain stuff. Get all technical on it, all that brain stuff. So, they're different. They're really, really, really different. And, when it comes down to it, people just don't know. You have confused people by being psychology majors. Your parents just, right? They all presume you're going to, so look, I was working with monkeys for part of my career and giving them amphetamine. Great job. And, and my parents couldn't understand. I mean, I'm giving monkeys amphetamine to study how Ritalin and other drugs affect hyperactivity in these monkeys and how that's related to their sensory systems. And I'm telling my parents about this and all this cool stuff we're finding, and they go, how does this have to do with being a therapist? It doesn't. It's not related. And so, I never got that across. They never quite understood what I did for them. You can kind of understand that as a guy who studies smell, right? But they never got it. And it's an amazing thing. So, clinical psychology, we've been talking about the problem of psychology and understanding it, but clinical psychology is there's some issues here. So let's chat about that. The paper, Tim Baker, Richard McFall, and Varda Sholem, 2009, so it's been a while. This was a very, very impactful paper. Current status and future prospects of clinical psychology. Doesn't sound like it would be a really influential paper, but it was. Science Magazine, which you may know, AAAS, that's the organization that publishes science, when this paper came out, published a headline, happily it was on the inside cover of the magazine, that said these three words: psychology eschews science. Because this paper described the lack of science in clinical psychology. These three people are faculty members at Wisconsin, Indiana, and Varda died recently, but she was at the University of Arizona. So they're clinical psychologists. They train clinical psychologists. They do therapy. They are concerned about their own field, and they went fact-finding to see what was going on in psychology. What they found was that people who are in practice in clinical psychology overwhelmingly use the methods that they learned in graduate school to work with people after that. Now think about that for a minute. So that you expect that's what's going to happen, right? But they don't change over time. And so a person who's been out for 30 years is using methods that are at least 30 years old. How would it be if your doctor did that? Yeah, I saw some people wince. So if your doctor did that, you'd be rich, right? Because you would have sued them for malpractice. So yet we look at folks who are doing this, and they're offering therapies. And so tell me, what technique has the greatest efficacy in psychology? What clinical technique? Let's test you guys. I have time. I got water. I got everything I need. What is it going to be? Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely right. Cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy is a relatively new therapy. So there are people practicing psychology today who don't use that, even though it has the greatest efficacy for the most problems that are out there, because they weren't trained in it and they haven't changed. And this is the findings that they're making. It's startling. They're really startling. So the rest of this, let me tell you a little bit more about their findings, right? They said clinical psychology failed to develop as an applied science. They gave it failing numbers. They said that it really just has not progressed. They did show that the evidence indicates that there is efficacy, and cognitive behavioral therapy is the therapy that they point to as having the best. And then they went to the programs that were training clinical psychologists, and they said, look, we have to have a science-based accreditation system so that we're looking at training people in statistics to understand the research methods that are being done in order to actually take those findings and extract, to turn them into applied procedures, to take what people are learning in the laboratory and turn it into therapeutic methods. That they need to do this, and they need to actually have better training in the basic science. That would be here and now at Hendrix and every other college in the country. So this is the other word that I want you to know. I want you to learn that phrase, evidence-based care. Your physician is now required by law, in I think every state, to provide services to you based on evidence-based care. That means scientific evidence leads to the therapies that they're using. So if we learn tomorrow that a particular drug was bad for people with certain kinds of conditions, and that physician gave the drug to you even after that evidence is out there, they're liable for hurting somebody when it happens, because that's a new finding. We're making it up. It's a new finding that's out there. They have to know it. In the past, by the way, how did this happen? That seems so reasonable, doesn't it? That you got to actually know the science in order to help somebody with medicine. That was not how it worked in the past. It worked in the past because you actually would have a panel of experts who would decide what was called the standard of care. So that was the standard of care model that existed. And you would have expert witnesses in a malpractice case saying, well, this is the current standard of care, and Dr. X did not violate that standard of care. He didn't do anything wrong. But if Dr. X did something for which there's research evidence that he shouldn't have done it, that's now a problem for Dr. X. So shouldn't we think that we want clinical psychologists who are out there helping folks to stand to that same level of scrutiny? And I think we might. I think we really need, clinical psychology is hard. It's a hard job to help people. It can be a very sad job. It can be a job that you take home with you. It can be a lot of different things. But it's also a responsibility to those patients to actually do your best for them. And I would argue that science is going to provide the best model for you to do that. At least it's something that we know is a falsifiable model. If you're doing something that is wrong, ultimately you're going to find that model falsified. So, this is not just an academic issue, and I'm about to bring up something that is a bad subject. New York Times, this was February 15th. Trump focuses on mental health over guns. So, this is not about President Trump. This is a common, when I was working in DC, I was working in Senator Feinstein's office, by the way, and there were a number of mass shootings that occurred over the year that I was there, and we worked on looking at legislation and changing various ways of managing this, seeing what we could do in terms of floating ideas with other members of Congress about, and their staff, about what they would accept, what they wouldn't accept, and we got, I utterly failed in doing this. And I can tell you that this idea that mental health professionals can somehow talk to somebody for 25 minutes and be able to tell you that they're dangerous is an idea that a lot of people want to believe is true. And the evidence that that's true is there is none. It's not possible. It's not possible, certainly currently. Now I'll mention one other thing here. I don't know if you guys saw the other news. So one of the other things that I deal with are folks with concussions. And I'm interested in football and concussions. And so I actually, with my lab group, have worked up, behavioral tests that we could use on the sidelines of actually trying to assess if a kid has a concussion during a football game. What happened last week, anybody know? It's a blood test for concussions approved by FDA. So, is it unimaginable to you that we would have a blood test for violence? Hadn't thought about that. Hadn't even begun to think about it. Well, let me introduce that idea to you. I've never heard it before. But you need, because you are going to be the future of this field, you need to think broadly about what's possible and to know the science that underlies these things. So if you're interested in violence, if you want to see these stop, as we call it, you are going to need to think about all of the ways that you can get traction on this and make a difference in finding something to stop these kinds of things, violent acts. Most of the gun violence that happens in America is suicide. Is there some kind of biomarker that we could use to help identify people who are on the verge of suicide? Is there a biomarker that is there a cognitive test that we could use for that? What kinds of things are out there that are doing this? Because frankly, that 20-minute interview that we've had and that the person who is the alleged perpetrator in this case had with lots of officials in Florida, and it didn't work. It hasn't worked with a lot of people. So it's a public problem we need to solve. And the way to do this is difficult, but I think you need to broaden your ideas. And I'm broadening them to think about science. So that's my pitch here. So I want to tell you a little bit more about psychology and that part of it, because we're talking about using scientific psychology to solve problems. And that is something that is called applied scientific psychology, and that's a stupid name, by the way. I do applied scientific psychology. Well, that's ridiculous, right? Nobody says that. It's not a name that's used very often. People don't say it much. And I'm just going to tell you some stories, after I have a little more water, of the ways that this has been implemented. So I was in DC for a year, and I'm not asking what you think of the Affordable Care Act. Let's not go there. Let's tell you that when the Affordable Care Act was implemented, the website that housed the Affordable Care Act probably could not have been worse. That it was something that was launched and people would try to get insurance on that and they were absolutely unable to do so. It would lock their computer up, they would have to reboot. You all know what that's like. And so they eventually stopped. They tried and tried and tried. It would go off and wander around. There would be no answer, there would be no response. So they shut it down. Into Washington flooded a bunch of cognitive psychologists who deal with software and the design of software to try and change the software in a very short period of time so that the next wave, when it's introduced, would actually have people who would sit and wait rather than looking at a spinning cursor, would read what other things are available, look at other kinds of things, would be entertained during the time that they were getting the calculations done. That became known as nudge science. And so nudge science is a type of applied psychology that uses attention, cognitive skills, your memory, all kinds of things to get you to pay more attention to different places. It's, of course, really important in designing software. But it turns out that this group, they're still in DC. They're still there working diligently on government page after page after page, fixing them so they will work better for us. So that, anyone know about that? Exactly. Nobody knows that psychologists do that. So they're there working for us. Tomatoes? Anybody? No one like tomatoes here? Yeah, exactly, right? Would you like to taste your tomatoes? Yes. How about this? I'm going to tell you something that's a dream, right? It's a dream. It's a dream that you could go to a grocery store in America and find a tomato that was lovely and tasted good. Okay? Hasn't happened to me yet. But I hope that someday it will happen. And the folks at the University of Florida are trying to do the same thing. So they are genetically engineering tomatoes to actually withstand the rigors of travel without bruising and yet be soft and have flavor. And Linda Bartoshuk, who is a psychologist, past president of the Association of Psychological Science, faculty member at Yale, part of my training there, has moved to the University of Florida where she is a professor who is working on the flavor aspects of this with geneticists to help design the chemicals that will continue to, what are the chemicals that taste good in tomatoes? She's found them. I don't know what they are. And so she is helping those chemicals be produced by the genetic engineering that's in tomatoes in order to produce tastier tomatoes. That's a big thing. Look around. So I put that picture in a grocery store, which seems innocuous enough, but it's there because every can, every package of cereal, everything that's in a package there had a psychologist design the flavor of it. Didn't know that that was a job psychologists do. Beer? Yeah. Beer is designed by flavorists who are trained as psychologists more than any other field. So they are coming to say, what is the market segment? So here, how does industry work in this way? Let's talk about making beer. I know none of you have had any experience with this. But, so you're gonna make some beer, and you say, well, what kind of beer is it? What do you want to, who do you want to sell to? What's the demographic there? We're looking to sell to college students who are underage. Excellent. Okay. What is that going to be? So you start looking for a beer that's sweet. Sorry, you like sweet. And so you're going to, but bitter. Some of you will drink that much of the bitter, but the sweet is really, it's a big deal. So you know, they're going to create a taste profile based on the demographic that's there because they know what you like. They know what kinds of salad dressing you like. Salad dressing, really. Tell me what would happen to weight in America if we had a nutritive, zero-calorie salad dressing that everybody absolutely loved. Right. I sat with her, the woman who's working on that, at breakfast one morning, talking about it. Think that'll change obesity in America? Yeah. Then you got this guy, Mark Rosekind. You didn't expect to see a picture. Mark R. Rosekind, Yale PhD in clinical psychology. Mark, interesting guy. Let me start down. I'm going to start here, right? So he was an undergraduate at Stanford working with Bill DeMint, that's a name you know, and he left that to come to Yale and get a PhD, and he went from there to eventually chief of operations at NASA Ames. He doesn't fly. He's a sleep guy. And did you know pilots sleep? Did you know we don't want them to sleep when they're flying? How would you make sure they don't? How do you monitor that? How do you make sure they got sleep the night before? What do you require them to do? Mark did that research, and NASA was the supporting group. He then actually started his own company, and that company was to help drivers maintain alertness on the road. And he actually was appointed as, from President Obama as the board member. There are 5 board members of the National Transportation Safety Board. That is the board that investigates all the big accidents that you've heard of. And he was bumped out of that job by President Obama to be the director of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And he's the person that Jen doesn't know, I don't think, that he was the one who gave you the book that allowed you to find your internship that you were discussing that summer. So there's a little connection. And of course, he won the National Sleep Foundation's Honorable Lifetime Achievement Award for all of his work on sleep. Do you know that psychologists are out there making roads safer? Cognitive psychology and physiological psychology combined to be better sleep. And there are these guys. I'm going to get going quick. Hey, they're just Nobel laureates. Economists? Nah, they're psychologists, right? They're all members of the Association of Psychological Science. Here's last year's Richard Taylor in Chicago, Danny Kahneman, Kurt Simon, and there are others who are psychologists who are changing economic science because they're clinical psychologists. So take a minute. Here we go. Psychology is misidentified as clinical therapeutic, right? You have also clinical psych as a graduate subfield. I want you to remember that. And the argument is that it needs more science. Psychology is everything. Right? It overlaps with neuroscience, but it's not contained in neuroscience. This is the one I really want you to get. It's scientific psychology is mature, it is thriving, and it is multidisciplinary. And then this guy, scientific psychology, it's a stupid thing. So what are you going to do? How do you identify psychology as a scientific valuable? Requires expertise. It's not something you can just guess at. And it's the background of scientific training for therapists. This one's really important, right? We need those therapists. We need them to do great work. And we're not thinking about psychology in that way. So, any ideas? I'll help you. This is the National Science Foundation's website, and these are the divisions of the National Science Foundation. Here you come to the bottom, and you have social, behavioral, and economic sciences. They don't mention psychology except there. It's not a main division, it's a little division. If you go through a lot of their literature, it's not a word they use very often because that word is puzzling to people as to why is psychology in a National Science Foundation document. They use the term behavioral science. They will use behavioral and cognitive sciences for one of the divisions that's there. So, I'm going to recommend that we think about a change in psychology. And so the question is, what's going to happen next? And so here's the interaction with neuroscience part. Here's what we got. This is the theory of change. Clinical psychology is here. We have this interaction with neurochemistry, the same as we've had it. But let me tell you what's going on. Neuroscience is totally thriving. What does that mean? Well, it means money is pouring into neuroscience. You've heard about the cancer moonshot, right? You've heard about that. Well, the money that's pouring into Alzheimer's work is immense. And so what's happening is departments of neuroscience are hiring like crazy. They have support from all of, it's called overhead. It's the money you get when you have a grant. All this money from overhead, that's buying technical support, it's buying a technician, it's buying laboratory animals, it's buying all of these things, and all of these psychologists that do work that's related to neuroscience are moving. Now, the question is, will they move into neuroscience and have behavioral science disappear or not? It's a really tough question. But one of the things you notice I've done here is I've moved the circle that was psychology out, and I've got clinical psychology engaged in behavioral sciences, but not fully encased there, right? I like Venn diagrams, right? It's the thing. It's like medicine, right? I've been playing the role here that we need to think of clinical psychology in the same organizational way that you think about medicine, where you are an undergraduate in a basic science department, that would be called behavioral science, and you do your undergraduate basic science work in this behavioral science department, and from there, you then move into your graduate program, which is in clinical psychology. Hopefully that program provides you with good scientific background so you can do evidence-based care. That would be the hope. But with neuroscience being so strong, we're not really sure what's going to happen. Ooh, I forgot to tell you, if you do this, by the way, you'll get to play with economists. That may be good or bad. We'll see. What happens if neuroscience takes over the behavioral side of psychology? Well, you have social psychology and developmental psychology, which are left, and of course clinical would be a part of this too. And so they're going to move away from this. That's this, which we think of as, which most people will think of as the scientific side of psychology. It's kind of wrong, by the way. It's the one that has the toys, right? So these are the ones that have the electrodes and all of the other pieces to it. Social psychologists do brilliant science, but we don't think of it that way. We think of that as really purely a social science and not so much a biological or neuroscience. But this split really could be coming. You know, and I know from we have a small department. It's really not that much different from you guys. And you know, as we're looking at this growth of the major and how we're going to manage the department, there's intensive pressure for people to become a member of a neuroscience department, which would take them out of psychology. And so what is your psychology department going to look like with people who have that background gone, who teach the physiological psychology, who teach sleep, who teach these other areas? What is that going to be like? And I think it's going to be something where you find this part of psychology which kind of drips away from that neuroscience underpinning that we've always had. So we're just about done. Just what I thought. Psychologists and behavioral views it as a purely objective and experimental branch of the natural sciences. I like that word. I think that's great. There were issues with John Watson, of course, but it's a good word. So, thank you. I recognize my little friend here, Chicken Little. So what do you think? What's going to happen? Anybody able to tell the future? Tea leaves, chicken entrails, what? Your preferred method of telling the future? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about, specifically when you mentioned the shooting and identifying the genome. I
Yeah.
know that they're breaking down the genome right now
Right.
and trying to figure that how do you think psychology can add to how science is already trying to break down the genome? And do you think that those violent characteristics could show up, or is it more?
Well, absolutely, the violent characteristics can show up in the genome, but the genome is not your behavior. So it's the behavior that's the critical piece there, and so the genome is only partially predictive of your behavior. So this is the part that, I really hate the nature-nurture kind of argument. But the reality is that your genome leads to a certain set of characteristics. And by the way, it's not just the genome, but which of those genes are in fact turned on that is important here. But they're dealing with the environment too. And so those genes interacting with the environment are what the issue is. And so you're all interacting with the environment with your own set of genetics, unless you've got an identical twin. So all of that is actually really, I want to know the interaction here. In some sense, I care less about the genome as it lays out and as a static entity. It's the interaction that's going to give me that idea. But one of the ideas is that if you have that interaction going on, and perhaps you have a particular gene that encodes for impulsivity in a way that others don't, then because we're now in the neuro law world, are you going to arrest these people before they do something? That's hard. That's a hard concept to think about. So now you've got a blood marker which says it's imminent, right? Your violence is imminent. You're going to have an outburst in an imminent way. Well, now I've got more of a reason to restrict a person's rights, which is what we're talking about. And that's, you gotta have a lot of evidence to do that. So that's what I say. I throw that out there as just one of the possibilities that are out there. There's a lot of stuff going on that has to do with thinking about violence in this area. And honestly, a lot of very good science. So, what are the best markers for these kinds of violent behaviors that underlie this? It's impulsivity. That is actually key. Drugs are a very important part of this equation, and the shooters tend to be young and male. Okay, so that's your set. Now, that young, by the way, is like under 30. Right? So there are some exceptions to that, certainly. So there are places, Indiana being one of them, I mentioned this to folks at lunch today. Indiana is a place that allows police on a domestic violence call to go in and assess the situation and decide they're going to take the firearms away from the person in the house. So that's the Second Amendment has, the Supreme Court has said that's okay so far. So that's being done in Indiana and 4 other states. So that turns out actually to have real merit as a way of reducing this. There are already data coming from Indiana and these other states that has actually dropped the average number of deaths from guns in domestic violence cases. So there are, that doesn't involve a blood test, right? That's looking at demographic data as a way of doing this. But it's, once again, I'm going to argue it's a scientific approach to the problem. It's an evidence-based approach. I want to push that because I believe deeply science is our best way to solve society's problems. Yes?
With the rise of neuroscience, do you see fields like clinical neuropsychology adapting and changing to take on more of those new methodological approaches like fMRI and CT and things like that?
I absolutely hope so. So we have this massive amount of data that are out there, and to think that we're going to not talk about that and talk about, concentrate on relationships, right, and exclude these other things, which we know are important for another word. That just doesn't make any sense to me. Relationships are a very important. Think about it as a statistical problem, right? What percentage of a person's violence is associated with the relationships? What percentage of it is associated with the genetics? What is associated with what they saw on TV or something that happened to them in the last 24 hours? How does that all break down? And so now you're thinking about an equation that actually is a predictor for violence when you think of it that way. And why would somebody limit themselves to what I would call traditional things that are part of the clinical interview? I think we need to think broadly about it. Yes?
One thing that kind of saddened me in your last diagram is the wide divergence between biological psychology and more applied clinical stuff. It seems sad that what's going on the biological side can't inform these best practices over here on the right,
So I couldn't agree with you more. And we don't know which of those outcomes is going to happen. So there's a chance for us to take a stand here and do something about it. So, and I mention this because this has happened before in biology. You guys are probably not aware of this, but biology, you know, when molecular biology was born and started to thrive, we had the Human Genome Project, and we poured money onto molecular biology. It became an enormous place for people to be trained. I was at Yale during this time. On the street where the psychology department was, you had the zoology department. At the end of the street, you had MB&B. That was the molecular biology and biochemistry department. It was a cathedral of science. It was 11 stories tall. It was this beautiful edifice, and the zoology building had broken windows in it. So, you know, so you look at this and you go, I wonder where, you know, the money's going. And the answer is organismic biology was floundering at this time, and molecular biology was just ascending. And time passed, and the two realized they loved each other, and they needed one another, and they got back together. Not always, and not always happily, but there was, you know, this reunion that was necessary because I got all these genes. I wonder what they do. Oh, we could tell you about that if you talked to us. And so that became how people got back together and did this work. And so we're the beneficiaries of this. We understand genetics way better now as a result of that. And I think exactly the same thing is true. But I think we need to be behavioral science in order for that to happen. And to embrace the fact that clinical psychology is an outcome of great behavioral science. I think I have to stop.
Well, it's 8. But we want to thank Dr. Lorig
Thank
for
you.
a great talk, and he'll stick around for a little bit. If
I
you
will.
have questions.
I still have water. Good.
So if you leave, you need to, but also if you want to talk to him one-on-one.
Yeah, that'd be great. Happy to.
Thank you.